Hello from Jerusalem and welcome to Beit Avi. Thank you for joining us. Since in a few days we'll be marking here in Israel Holocaust Memorial Day, we choose to devote this virtual tour with tour guide Braun to illegal immigrants who came from Europe to Palestine, Israel, after the Holocaust. We call them Mapilim, and we are happy that Ani will be taking us to Atlit to see how they came to Israel and what kind of receptions they received once they arrived here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamar, and good evening. My name is Braun, tour guide, and this is the third session of a three-part series of virtual tours in which we're talking about the Et HaChadasha, the new era of the modern-day Zionist movement. And over our last couple of sessions, we've been talking about three different variables that are coming together. And one of them is a nation, a people, the other is a land, and the third is a language. And today we're going to be mostly talking about the nation, the people that are coming to over here. We're going to be visiting the museum of what used to be the detention camp of Atlit, where Ma'apilim, Holocaust survivors, were making their way over here to the land of Israel, and they were detained in Atlit. Why? How? What's the background? What's the story? Including personal stories, that's going to be our virtual tour today. But at the end of the day, as we're making our way through our virtual tour today, it is very important to remember the following thing. Today we are talking about a Zionist story of determined people who were full of hope regarding coming to the land of Israel and creating a Jewish state over here. Now, how does it start? So before we start moving around over here and getting on a ship and making our way over here to the land of Israel with the Ma'apilim, with these new immigrants that are making their way, or these Olim Chadashim that are making, and Holocaust survivors that are making their way to the land of Israel, let's give a little background what led to the events that we're going to be talking about today. First of all, where are we? We're in Atlit. Atlit is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It is right south of Haifa. The British are going to be ruling in the land of Israel. They have a mandate over here. Their mandate, the British will arrive over here in 1917 in the midst of World War I, and they're going to be here for about 30 years. A lot is going to happen during these 30 years. And let's now jump forward to the mid-1930s, to not even the late 1930s, to 1936 through 1939, where we have what's called the Great Arab Rebellion. Now, why is the Great Arab Rebellion going to be taking place? Because we need to understand, when the British arrived over here in 1917, they're going to start developing the land of Israel after the Turks were over here for hundreds of years before. And there are two populations over here in the land, both the Arab population and the Jewish population. Both populations are growing, but I want to talk today about the Jewish population that is going to be growing. If you were with us on previous tours, we spoke about the first couple waves of Aliyot, and in the 19th century and turn of the 20th century. We're now moving forward when the British are already over here. We have the third, fourth, and fifth Aliyot through the 1920s and into the 1930s. The Arab leadership, such as Haj Amin al-Husseini, are very unhappy with this, and this will lead to the years of the Great Rebellion against the other inhabitants in the land of Israel, and especially against the British are ruling over here. One thing leads to another, right? This is history. In 1939, as a result of the Arab pressure, the Great Rebellion, the British mandate come out with what's called the White Paper. What's the White Paper? The White Paper basically is a quota. They say over the next 5 years, there is room in the land of Israel for a total of 75,000 Jews to immigrate to the land of Israel. May I remind you that the year is 1939, World War II breaks out, the Holocaust takes place, and this will all end in 1945. 1945, there are many thousands of Holocaust survivors in Europe. They want to move to the land of Israel. It's not the state of Israel yet, because may I remind you that the state of Israel is going to be declared only in May of 1948. We mentioned that briefly in our Tel Aviv tour. We're still 1945, so they want to come to the land of Israel. But the White Paper quota is still in effect. The British government is not going to remove it. So what will happen in Europe is as follows. We have what's called the mass migration, or the mass wandering, of many, many thousands of Jews that don't have a home to return to. They want to go to another country. And many of them want to make aliyah to the land of Israel. They're going to go, many of them, to DP camps, displaced person camps, in Germany, in Austria, and from there they're going to start making their way to ports in the southern area of Europe. Who's going to help them? Who are they going to meet? So there were various organizations that were helping them, but the main organization that helped them at the end of the day, along with many others, is what's called the Mossad Le'aliyah Bet. It belonged to the Haganah, the pre-IDF, pre-Israeli army from before 1948. They're going to meet these people in the DP camps, teach them Hebrew, start learning agriculture, start preparing them for their journey and for their move to the land of Israel. And they're going to start preparing ships to put them on these ships in order to make their way to the land of Israel. But wait a minute. We just said that there's a quota. The British aren't going to allow them into the land of Israel, which is why this was also called Aliyah Bet or Aliyah Bilti Legalit, illegal immigrants, at least in the eyes of the British. So we are now going to we're now going to the Atlit detention camp. We're going to make our way to the detention camp. But before we get to the detention camp and our story, even though we're there in reality right now in our virtual tour, let us get onto a ship in one of the ports of Europe, and let us try to make our way to the land of Israel with these ma'apilim, with these immigrants, these Holocaust survivors that are making their way. They're determined. Tzionim, they're Zionists, they're determined to make their way to the land of Israel and create a new home over here, and they're going to need to make their way past the British on their way to the land of Israel. And we are now going to enter this ship over here, which has a story in and of itself. We'll tell the story of this particular ship at the end. And here we are. We've come from the outside, and let's now walk inside. We're twisting and turning a little bit, and now what we're going to do is let's make our way inside. Now, as we're walking inside, let's not pretend for a moment. Let's leave the year 2022, and let's go back to sometime between the years 1945 to 1948. The specific years that we're going to be talking about today are right after the end of World War II, right after the end of the Holocaust. So there were also ships that made their way to the land of Israel during the Holocaust. I'm emphasizing really at the end of the day, end of the war, 1945, right up until the eve of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. We've arrived at the ports. The Mossad Aliyah Bet Haganah members are helping us out onto these ships over here. Now, the ships themselves were all bought from different places. Now, when the ships were bought in various conditions, usually not very, very good conditions, the idea is to try and cram as many people as possible onto these ships because there's such a big request and in order to make their way to the shores of the land of Israel. So a lot of times what happened is the inside the ships were gutted out and then not barracks, but simply bunk beds. Many, many boards of bunk beds were created. And if you have ships that had originally a capacity of X amount of people, now it's times 2. You'd have a ship with a capacity for 1,000 people. Now you're shoving 2,000 people inside, for example. And we're going to talk about the very difficult conditions as a result of this on the ship. But right now, let's head onto the ship over here. And because you're cramming so many people onto a small ship, the bigger ships, which held sometimes even over 4,000 people, and we're going to mention a couple of these specific ships later on, the process of people going inside sometimes took up even to 3 or 4 days. Can you imagine getting onto the ship and you're sitting and you're waiting as it's filling up for 3 or 4 days? You haven't even gone out into the high seas yet. What are you going to come with? So everybody was allowed in with one suitcase because space was a premium over here, right? Every inch was very important. And if I was having really an interactive virtual tour with you right now, what I would ask you is why don't you write to me in the chat, what would you put in this one suitcase of yours? If you were told you have room for one suitcase in the ship, what are you going to put inside of it? At the end of the day, most people took a blanket. Okay, let's be practical. It's cold. You need a blanket. And pictures. They're Holocaust survivors. They are taking with them the memories of their families. Pictures is everything. So we'll get on with the blanket, pictures, and maybe some other things. And that's what we're looking at over here. We can see a couple of these people making their way on with the suitcases. And let's twist around a little bit and turn and let's take a look at the other side of this room, of this ship over here. In order to see it, we're going to just jump through these steps over here. And on the other side, we can take a look. If we stand right in this circle, we'll try to feel as much as we can between these people. And they're sitting in their bunkers over here. Now, when the ship finally headed out to the high seas, the average amount of time on the high seas was 10 days, which means that even sometimes took a little bit longer. I don't know about you, I once went sailing. I once went out into the high seas in a relatively small boat. I personally could not stop throwing up. After a couple hours, that was it. We had to come back because of it. Now imagine being inside the ship over here. You're not on the deck. You're underneath. And we'll talk why that was in a couple of moments. But you're underneath most of the time. You're crowded like crazy. There's no air conditioning. People were sick. It's nauseating. It's extremely unpleasant. That's one thing that you need to deal with. Another thing is that you really can't go anywhere. During the day, you're not allowed to go up onto the deck. And why is that? Because let's go back again and understand politically what's going on. And I mentioned it already before. When these ships with these Holocaust survivors were on their way through the Mediterranean Sea to the shores of the land of Israel, they were, according to the British at least, illegal immigrants. The British were blockading the shores of the land of Israel from these ships to make it through to wherever they were trying to make it through, the ports or whatnot. Now, what the British also did is they sent planes that flew over the Mediterranean Sea looking for these ships. Now, in order to try and remain innocent, the people in the ships that were making their way to the land of Israel were told, don't go up onto the deck, because if you go up onto the deck, the planes flying overhead will see you, and they'll realize what kind of ship it is, and then they're going to stop us. So you had to remain down below the entire time during the day. At night, where you don't have planes flying over, you couldn't see anybody on the deck or whatnot, they would take turns and go up to the top. Although, again, if you're one of the larger ships with a few thousand people, you're taking turns. How often could you already go up to the deck in order to breathe fresh air? You're sitting down there. I mean, we can see these two people playing chess for hours on end. What would you do? You play games. You talk. Maybe you plan about what are you going to do. What are your plans when you arrive in the land of Israel? Everybody's been through the Holocaust. I can imagine those are many of the very difficult topics also. Maybe you're asking, oh, you're from this in this neighborhood. You're from this in this city. Maybe you know what happened to my family. Maybe you know what happened to my friends. I can also imagine many of these conversations that are taking place in the barracks over here. What we're going to do now is let's twist and turn. And we're going to, and I apologize, I'm trying to twist and turn easy so you don't feel dizzy. They felt dizzy on the ship 70, 80 years ago. That was enough. We don't need to do it as we're making our way over here. And we're going to go to the top of these steps over here, which is considerably more difficult than what it seems to you sitting at home. I practiced this a few times at home, and I fell down the steps many times. But this time we made it up to the top. And let's go visit the barracks. Now, we've slid into the room with the various barracks, and let's take a look. We were talking about life, not in the barracks, excuse me, in the bunk beds is the word that I meant to say. We can see these boards over here again. These boards that created bunk beds, and we can look down and see here it's a little bit dark, but if we walk along, we can get the idea. Let's take another step forward. These were all created special. Now we get a bit of a better view over here of the beds. These were all created special for this voyage to the land of Israel. So as I mentioned before, when the ship was bought, it was gutted, and then after it was gutted, they spent however long they needed to spend building these bunk beds over here. And when we talk about a personal story of a family later on, Holocaust survivors that made it on one of these ships over here, we'll talk also about how one of the people over here in the personal story worked on creating these boards for these bunk beds over here. What are the different things or the amenities that we have on the ship now that we saw these bunk beds over here? In order to answer that, let's make our way out of this room. Let's go into the narrow hall over here. And as we're making our way through the hall, one room is the communications room. Now, there was a special unit in the Haganah, in the pre-Israeli IDF force, and they were called the Gideonim. Okay, the Gideonim worked Morse code. Now, why do you need this? Well, why do you need to work in codes? And the answer is pretty obvious. Then the reason is because of the British. We on the ship want to communicate with the other members of the Haganah that are waiting for us at whatever shores that they need to be waiting for us over here if we are able to run through the British blockade and get to the shores. So they would work the Morse code over here in order to make this connection. If we continue a little further along, though, let's go visit the infirmary, which I really would not want to visit over here. See, this is where the doctor is going to be sitting. Now, think about it for a minute. The ships went from anywhere between dozens, many times hundreds, and we're going to also be looking at some of the ships where there were thousands of people. You have one doctor, maybe two. How do you create a line for the doctor? How do you... First of all, you need to make the decision that you're going to wait for the doctor because you're not feeling good, all right? Is it worth it with other people that are waiting? And how does the doctor decide who to treat before the other? I mean, these are the very difficult conditions that they were in. And if it was decided that you were really, really sick, which I really would not want to be somebody who was really, really sick to begin with, not to mention if you have so many people over here and the decision is to put you in this room over here, which is a little bit more comfortable, you've got to be really sick to be able to have the privilege to be in one of these beds over here. Let's say hello to the captain. In order to say hello to the captain, we are going to look at this room over here. All right? He has his own room, of course. He needs to have his privacy. There are many stories of different captains of the various ships that were making their way with the Ma'apilim to the land of Israel. And I want to briefly mention the captain of what is arguably the most famous ship of all the different ships that made their way to the land of Israel during these years. And that ship is called the Exodus. And their captain's name was Yitzchak or Isaac Aronowitz. Now, Isaac Aronowitz was born in Europe, but he moved to Israel when he was a little kid. And by the time that the summer of 1947 rolls around, he's 23 years old. He has a lot of naval experience, and he's going to be chosen to be the captain of the Exodus ship. The Exodus ship had 4,500 people in it, and we'll mention its story briefly a little bit later when we see a picture of the Exodus. Now, Ike, or as they like to call him a lot of times, Aronowitz, after the whole story of the Exodus, he went and he learned abroad. By the 1950s, he's already once again living in the land of Israel, and he's going to create a shipping company, and he's going to live a long and prosperous life. But he's always known, he's always connected to the story of the Exodus ship, which again, we'll say a little bit later. When he passes away in 2009, then Israeli President Shimon Peres said the following at the eulogy for Ike Aronowitz. He said the following, that Yitzchak or Ike Aronowitz made a unique contribution to the state which will never be forgotten. And I can almost see him in this room over here in the Exodus ship. But let's continue walking along. And one of the amenities that, of course, we need in an experience like this is a kitchen. And let's walk into the kitchen over here. Now, don't think of some big mess hall and a nice kitchen with tons and tons of food. Not at all. But rather, as we're turning around over here, we're going to come stand right here. And we can see, all right, it's pretty simple over here. This oven over here. There was a lack of food. There was a lack of water. It was a long journey. It was very difficult. But people realize that they're not coming over here on some pleasure cruise. They are determined to come to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, the Zionist story, in order to create a Jewish, or part of the project of creating a Jewish state. What we're going to do now in this multi-storied ship is let's go up these steps over here. And when we go to the top, we want to go right now to the wheelhouse, all right, which is where the area where the wheel of the ship is. And we're going to take a look inside. Here we go. And we're going to turn. And I have to tell you, it takes a little bit of practice at home in order to navigate our way through the ship over here and through this kind of technology. The technology is amazing, but we got to work on it a little bit. Now, as we're standing over here inside of the wheelhouse, and we can see the wheel of the ship, and we can see them checking out, and I can imagine them looking out the windows over here. And as they're looking out the windows over here, they're going to be looking, first of all, for anything that can be problematic on the high seas. And in addition to that, they'll also be looking up above to see if any British airplanes are on their way to over here. I think it's a little bit difficult to spend too much time in the ship. We mentioned the difficulties. It's rough. There's not a lot of air. It can be a little bit claustrophobic. So let's make our way out onto the deck of the ship. And as we make our way over here out onto the deck of the ship, it's nighttime. Okay, we're not going to want to be out here in the day because of the reasons that we mentioned before. And finally, we can get a little bit of a breath of fresh air. Now, as we're standing outside over here and we're looking at the ship, you may be asking, you may be wondering, this is not an original ship from the Ha'apala. This ship that we're looking at over here was actually bought in Latvia in 2006. It was a ship where they had fish that was frozen in big refrigerators that was brought from place to place. In 2006, it was bought from its owner. It was not in good shape. It had to be fixed up. It made its way to England. And also over there, the British were not willing to, pretty funny, think about it. Now that I think about it, I mean, a twist of history makes its way to the British on its way after, what happened over here 70 some odd years ago. And then the British don't let the ship leave their port because it wasn't in good enough shape. So they needed a Dutch ship to come and tow it all the way to the land of Israel. It'll get to the coast of the land of Israel, to Hadera. Now this thing is gigantic. A massive platform on a truck was brought, and the ship, called the Galina, was put onto this massive platform, which took up an entire highway, and you needed to remove electrical poles and traffic lights sometimes in order for it to get to place. They spent 4 nights moving it until it got into place. They fixed that for its purpose over here in the detention camp, and it was opened in the year of 2010. Look, that is the story of the Galina ship. Now, what I'd like to do is after we saw the story of the Galina ship, let us go to the PowerPoint. And when we go to the PowerPoint, let's tell a story of somebody who came to here, a Holocaust survivor, who made his way over here on one of these ships. And I want to thank a colleague, tour guide, and a friend of mine, Yaniv Levy, for giving me this information about his family. And the pictures are of his family. And this person over here, Dov, is his grandfather. May his memory be blessed. And Dov is a Holocaust survivor. If we take a look at a picture of this family over here, what we can see over here is, this is a picture of Dov. This is a class picture when he was a kid, okay, and in Europe. And that's Dov. His brother Tzvi is on the other corner over here. And there are a couple other family members over here that are in this class picture, because Dov, here's Tzvi and Dov, both of them survived the Holocaust, but there are 4 other family members, 2 of them in this picture, 2 not, that unfortunately did not survive the Holocaust. What happens is after surviving the Holocaust, Dov and Tzvi are going to make their way to Bucharest, Romania, where over there's a port, and they want to make their way to the land of Israel. They make the decision after, at the beginning, going back home. They realize there's nothing to go back home to, and Dov says to Tzvi, we need to make Aliyah to Eretz Israel. We need to make Aliyah to the land of Israel. When they get to Romania, when they get to Bucharest, Dov, during the Holocaust, had built boards for bunk beds. And he comes up to the ship that they're about to get onto, which is going to be called the Max Nordo ship. And he works on creating boards. Remember we mentioned they gut out the inside of the ship and whatnot and create a whole new inside? So they're going to do this. They're going to create the boards. And after they create the boards, they start loading people on. Now, Dov is going to meet another person who's going to become a lifelong friend of his. This person's name is Chaim. And Chaim has a sister. You might start to get the idea over here. His sister's name is Ita. All right, both Chaim and Ita, who come with other family members and with their father, they are Holocaust survivors. Now, Ita and Chaim have a problem. They have an elderly father. The preference at the time was not to take elderly people on the ship, but rather younger people, because there was more chance that they were going to survive the difficult journey that we just spoke about on their way to the land of Israel. Now, because it's a problem, they want their elderly father to get on the ship. Now, due to the fact that Dov had protexia, as we call it in Hebrew, he could pull strings because he helped create the inside of the ship, he's able to get their father onto the ship, and they will make their way to the land of Israel. Now, the route of the Max Nardo ship we can see over here. It's this blue line. It'll make its way from Romania all the way down eventually past Greece and Turkey and into the Mediterranean Sea, and it'll arrive at the land of Israel. The Max Nardo ship, with its almost 1,700 ma'apilim, is going to arrive in May of 1946. Now, take a look at this picture, and thank you to Yaniv, who's the grandson of Dov that we're talking about, who pointed the following fact out to me. When you look at the ship, it's tilting over to one side. And that's because when they saw the coast for the first time, they all ran out and they all ran over to one side, and the ship almost capsized. They had to yell at people, quickly, quickly go also to the other side so that the ship doesn't fall over. But the Max Nardau ship, like most of the ships that were making their way to the land of Israel, were caught by the British, were brought to the port of Haifa, and over there, from there, the people were taken to either the detention camp in Atlit or in Cyprus. Let's take a look at some of the other ships, the famous ships that made their way to the land of Israel. The most famous one that we mentioned before is the Exodus ship. And the Exodus ship was the biggest ship of them all, with 4,500 people. In the summer of 1947, it made its way with all these Holocaust survivors out of the port, one of the ports in France. It'll be spotted immediately. It's followed the whole way. It's followed by the British. They knew what was going on the whole way with airplanes and whatnot. And they were held up in international waters and then eventually towed to the port of Haifa. Now, in 1947, you're either going to the Atlit detention camp, or at that point, without getting to all the details, you're usually sent to the detention camps in Cyprus, which is what the Holocaust survivors on the Exodus ship thought was going to happen when they were dragged back onto another ship, onto a British ship in the port of Haifa. They were put into cages on this other ship, but the ship did not stop in Cyprus. It made its way back to France. And upon arriving to France, the Holocaust survivors were told that they have to get off the ship, which they refused to do for 2 weeks. So the British actually went back to Hamburg, Germany, and forcibly took these people off of the ship and sent back to the displaced persons camp. They were amongst the very first, when the state of Israel was created, they were brought to the land of Israel and settled over here. So that, very much in brief, is the story of the Exodus ship. Other ships, famous ships that made their way to over here, is the Enzo Sereni ship with 900 people. The Knesset Israel ship, also really one of the bigger ones, with 4,000 people. But all of these ships were caught and were caught by the British and brought either to the detention camps, as I mentioned before. A ship with a bit of a unique story is the ship that's called Shabtai Luzinski. Why is it unique? Because it managed to break through. It manages to not be spotted by the British, and it'll make its way to Chof Nitzanim, to the Nitzanim shore, which is in the southern area of the coast of Israel. And usually what happens with a large ship, you can't get so close to the shores. You need to stop far away, and then you're brought down into little boats, and little boats will bring you onto shore. But because they just wanted to, as fast as possible, get everybody onto the shore before the British will arrive, because they knew that the British were on the way, the Shabtai Luzinski ship just made it as close as possible to the shore, and 120 meters offshore, meaning about 400 feet offshore, it just rammed itself onto a sand embankment, and over there it got stuck. And what the people both on the boat and Haganah members waiting on the shore did is they started loading the people off as fast as possible. There were two options. If you were a good swimmer, you were told to swim to the shore. People on the boat would point you in the right direction. People waiting on the shore would come to the water to help you point you in the right direction. It was very confusing. It was still dark, whatnot. Anyway, whoever could swim, swam out to the shore. Whoever wasn't a good swimmer, which would be totally my case in this situation, you were loaded onto little boats that quit. And with these little boats, they also put a rope that made its way all the way from the boat, 120 meters to the shore. And then you could pull yourself on these teeny little dinghy boats along the rope that made it onto the shore. But the British get wind of what's going on, and they come to the beach. But along the way, Jewish members of the different towns that are in the area will also run over to the beach, and they're going to start mixing with the Holocaust survivors, with the Ma'apilim, with these new immigrants, these Olim Chadashim that have just gone off the boat. Now the British don't know what to do. I mean, you have the Jews who are living over here, and then you have at least in their eyes, the illegal immigrants. Who do you detain? Who do you send to the detention camp? And to try and confuse them, everybody over there gave the same answer to the British when they asked them, "Who are you? Where are you from?" And they all said, "Ani Yehudi me'eretz Israel." I am a Jew from Eretz Israel. And I can just imagine that most of the people who were already living over here before were immigrants themselves from sometime in the past, so you could all put on different accents, and the British had a very hard time differentiating who from who. As a result of that, they arrested many of them, and a whole mishmash of both of the Ma'apilim who were making their way to the land of Israel, along with Jews who were already living over here before, were sent to the Cyprus detention camp. This ship led to a song being written that is called Shoshana Shoshana, which is translated into rose. Shoshana is a flower, which is a rose. Chaim Chefer, famous Israeli poet, is going to write this song. Why is it called Shoshana Shoshana, or Rose Rose? Because the original name of the Shabtai Luzinski ship was Susanna. It was named after someone of the members of the Haganah who was killed in a car accident that year, but it was called Susanna, so you turn Susanna into Shoshana. And they wrote this song, Shoshana Shoshana. Chaim Chefer wrote the song Shoshana Shoshana to tell the story of the ship. And I just gave a very short version of it, and it says like this: Shoshana Shoshana Shoshana, rose, 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 the moon is being carried to the cloud. Like him to you rose, the ship rose. At sea the captain will still sail. And then the chorus connects to something that we mentioned before, where the British were confused. They didn't know who to arrest, so they arrested a little bit of everybody. It was a very awkward situation when the short Samuel to Cyprus was brought. But even when he sat behind the fence, he sang such a cheerful tune, Shoshana, Shoshana, Shoshana. Short Samuel was one of the people who were working on the ship, and because of the confusion, and he also said, "Ani Yehudi Meretz Yisrael, a Jew from the land of Israel," he was also arrested. Look, what I want to do now is I want to go back to our technology and let us go to the next stage that we're talking about. By the way, I meant to give thanks at the very beginning to the different organizations through which we're able to run this tour. The first one, of course, is Beit Avi. We're running on their platform over here, which is wonderful. Thank you to Tamar and Beit Avi. I also want to thank the Atlit Museum that we're now going from one spot to the other virtually for giving me the permission to run the tour of their site. And of course, I want to thank Dive Virtual Technology, whose technological platform we are using right now. And this is just one of their many couple dozen virtual tours that they have around the country. Okay. What I want to do right now is like this. We're going to move a little bit. We're now standing in the detention camp. The ship is also in the detention camp in the museum today, right? It's at the edge of it. But now let's walk. So we have arrived. From the ship. We were taken to the port of Haifa. And from Haifa, we were brought either by train or by bus. Different stories for different people were brought different ways to the detention camp over here. Our bags are checked when we arrive to make sure that we have no weapons. And then we're going to be taken over here to what's called the disinfection barracks, or the disinfection shed would probably be the more correct word to use. In order to enter the disinfection shed, let's make our way to the door. All right. And in order to enter the door, we are going to stand right over here. And now we are going to walk inside. Now look, if we're walking hand in hand, I'll tell you the truth. I mean, as someone who always found this history very, very fascinating, in a way, I always wanted to go back and sort of like live a little bit what they lived. When I grew up and realized what the atrocities really were, I definitely, of course, would not want to go back. But I would be curious to go back in a time capsule and sort of like be a fly on the wall and stand there and see the reactions on their faces and listen to them and really soak in the atmosphere. I'd find it really, really fascinating. So, of course, we can't go back in time and be a fly on the wall, but we can try to relive their experiences in the atmosphere that they were feeling back then. And to try and do that, let's see what these ma'apilim who survived the atrocities in Europe, what they're looking at. What are the things that the British have them do when they make their way into here? So first of all, when we walk inside, we can see this is sort of like an oven, this is an oven, which was heated up via steam, where they were told to put their clothes. The men and women were separated, and they were told to take their clothes off and put their clothes inside over here, where their clothes were clean from lice. Their clothes didn't come out clean. It's not like a washing machine with water. Their clothes came back still dirty and filthy and sweaty, but they weren't with lice inside. But the problem with cleaning this way is also a lot of times the clothes will shrink. So if these are the only clothes you have in your back and you get them back shrunk, you have a problem. In addition to that, what's inside their pockets a lot of times? Family pictures. We mentioned the pictures before. These are survivors, and many of them, these pictures were all they had from their family, and the pictures are ruined. And so they simply forgot to take them out with all of the balagan, the mess that was going on getting organized, and they lost their pictures, which was really a tragedy for them. DDT was thrown onto them by the British in order to delouse them, and then they go into the shower over here and to warm water. And you could ask the question, well, how did they feel when they were making their way through the showers over here? And there were lots of different reactions. For some people, after what they went through in the Holocaust, it was a trauma. They refused to go in. For many people all said, I haven't had a shower in a week or two, and they actually jumped in. At this point, though, most of the people had already been through a thing or two after the Holocaust, and they realized that the British are not the Nazis, and they realized that it's going to be okay, and they got into the showers over here. In general, there was a feeling of hope, all right? Realizing, okay, at least we're over here in the land of Israel, all right? Yes, we've been through what we've been through, but we're also over here in the land of Israel. May not be ideal with the British over here, but we're over here, and this is another phase on our way to fulfill our Zionist dream, to be a part of creating a state over here in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. We just went through the showers over here, and what I want to do is let's come stand and take a look at the pictures that are on the wall, and in trying to recreate this atmosphere, let's take a look a little bit at these faces. These are faces of people who are smiling. These are faces of people who are happy. These are faces of people who realize that they have a much brighter future in front of them. Now in this picture over here, we can see men and women together. This picture was taken, here let's try to zoom in a little bit. Here we go, that's a little bit better. This picture was taken in the middle of the camp, physically, because what happened was once you got to the camp in Atlit, men and women were separated. There were up to 100 barracks. There were about 100 barracks inside of the detention camp in Atlit. One side was for men, the other side was for women, and there was a separation between, and you couldn't always meet. You may ask the question, why did the British do this? And the answer is simple. They wanted to separate families so that people would not try to escape. You're not going to run away without your family. But depending when and depending who was the captain at the camp, sometimes for an hour a day and sometimes totally throughout the day, just not at night, the families could meet and spend time together. And over here we can see them smiling. Chaim Weitzman actually was visiting them at this point, and this particular picture is being taken, and people are smiling. We can turn around, we can twist more around a little bit, and as we're twisting around a little bit more, let's take a look at another picture over here on the wall. And this picture, as we stand right over here, is a picture of people dancing the hora. All right? We can talk a little bit about life inside of the camp if they're dancing hora. That was the classic dance at that time. And in order to speak about their life inside of the camp and connect it to the hora dancing, let us walk out of this area over here, and let's go enter one of the barracks, okay? And we just walked through the wall. I always wanted to do that and be like Superman. Okay, so here we go. We're making our way along, and we can see a few barracks over here. Now, these barracks are all reconstructed. The only original thing left from the camp is the tin, sort of like shack that we were inside before with the showers. Everything else has been reconstructed over the years. We've entered the sleeping barracks that we can see at this very moment. And as we look inside, let's take another step inside so that we can really feel like we're inside. And we can look and see these beds, all right? So when we enter inside today, I don't know if we can see 20 beds, 20 some odd beds. This wasn't the reality back then between the years 1945 to 1948. To be honest, the detention camp was in use really from 1940 to 1948, but I'm more focusing on the last few years of it with the ships that I was talking about before. Usually they were more like between 40 to 70 beds inside, which means that they're all connected to one another. There was no space in between. So you can't get on the bed from the side, you get on the bed from the edge, from the bottom, however you want to look at it. We can also see their bags, okay, that are being held up, strung up into the air. Why are their bags with their belongings strung up into the air and not on the floor? Because there's no room. If you have all these beds, there's no room, you put it up on top. In addition to that, you have mice, you have rats on the floor. You don't want them to be getting to your bags over there. In addition to that, if we're starting to talk a little bit about daily life, let's think about the heat inside of these rooms, right? There's a tin roof on top, okay? You don't want to be sitting inside it during the day. It is boiling hot. If you've traveled through Israel in the summer, especially in the heat of July, August, you realize it's very, very hot. And not only that, if you're along the coast, it's very humid. I can't imagine being in here, forgetting the day. I mean, in the day, at least, maybe you go outside at night, you need to be inside. I don't know how people, to be honest with you, sleeping must have been a nightmare. It was so hot. And in the winter, it was also very, very cold. If we turn around and we're talking about the things that they did over here on a daily basis, let's take a look at another one of the very few things that's actually original over here. I mentioned the barracks are not original. They were reconstructed. The museum was open to the public in 1987. What we're looking at over here is this. These wooden logs, if you want to call it that, is original. This graffiti over here is original. One of the things that people did back then in their spare time, and they were anywhere between a few days to weeks to even months inside. The longest time someone was in the Atlit detention camp was 23 months, but usually between a few weeks to a couple months. One of the things that they would do is they would take silverware from the kitchen and they would etch names and symbols into the wood over here. Why? A, because it's something to do, and B, because they're hoping that somebody will see it, maybe a family member who survived the Holocaust, maybe neighbors or friends who survived the Holocaust, and they'll see it and they'll know to look for them. You need to realize, of course, back then there's no internet and it's not like today. So we can see the names from back then, we can see the symbols from back then, which for me is always one of the more fascinating things to point out to people when I'm guiding inside of the Atlit detention camp. What else did they do when they were over here? Well, they were members of the Jewish agency or the Haganah that came into the camp over here, and they would teach them Hebrew, and they would also teach them different options of working when they leave the camp, sort of the textile industry or how to pack fruit, which gave them work options when they left the camp over here. People would create paths inside the camp to walk through. They'd create little gardens. They'd clean the guardhouses a lot of times. They like to go clean the guardhouses a lot of times because the guards would a lot of times give them information regarding what's going on outside of the camp when they spoke with them, when they were cleaning their guard huts and whatnot. And this gave them a lot of things to do. Look, the detention camp was in use. The British built it in 1939. They used it from 1940 to 1948. There were 40,000 people that made their way through the camp. At any given time, you could have up to 4,000 people inside of the camp over here. After 1948, or later on into the 1950s, it wasn't used, of course, as a detention camp anymore. The Israeli government housed new immigrants temporarily over here in the detention camp during the time of the Ma'abarot, when the population of Israel doubled in size over the first 5 years when the state of Israel was created. You literally had people living in tents in those first couple of years. So Atlit turned into one of these places. After the 6th or 1967 Egyptian POWs, prisoners of war, were brought into Atlit. And then it was sold to a contractor in the late 1970s he took everything apart. Like I said, there's nothing original left besides the lousing shed the disinfection shed that we went into before. He took everything apart. He was going to use it for his own purposes, and then there was a big public outcry saying, this is so much history, how can you do that? At which point, the decision was made, the museum was created, and it was open to the public in 1987. But let's go back to our PowerPoint. Now that we turned around a lot inside the virtual, and when we go back to our PowerPoint right now, let's talk about one crucial event that took place over here in Atlit. In order to do that, we need to go back to the fateful early hours of the morning of October the 10th, 1945, the Great Escape. There were at that point 210 people inside of the camp. And a decision is made by the Haganah to have these people escape. Now, in order to do that, a plan was created by the Haganah in cooperation with the kibbutzim of kibbutz Beit Avi, which is the yellow marker in the middle, and kibbutz Yagur, which is the yellow marker on the right, east of over there, and other places to house the escapees, the people that they plan to have escaped from the detention camp. Now, Nachum Sarig, who was the commander of the operation, had several members of the Haganah sneak their way into the camp a couple days before to prepare the area, get people prepared and ready to escape. A hole was opened up into the fence in the early mornings of October 10, 1945, and the 210 people who were inside of the camp started to escape. Now, the Haganah members told them to leave their suitcases behind because the idea was for them to escape part of the way by car and part of the way by foot over the Carmel mountain range. But do you think that people are going to leave their suitcases behind, suitcases that they that their entire previous life is inside there with them, that they brought all the way from Europe. That was not going to happen, and they escaped with their suitcase, which really hindered their advancement, but this was their whole life. They weren't going anywhere without it. And they're going to escape, and like I mentioned before, part of the way they're going to make via cars, a lot of the way they're going to make via foot. Now, I don't know if you've traveled through the Carmel mountain range before, but when we look at the Carmel mountain range, and we use our mouse over here, to show the route, here's Atlit, okay? Now, Atlit is on the coast, everything is flat. But this whole range over here is a mountain range called the Carmel mountain range. And once they come out from Atlit, they need to climb up this mountain range over here. Here is Kibbutz Beit Oren, okay? They get to over there, and then the plan is to continue down the other side to Kibbutz Yagur. These aren't people, these aren't athletes, these aren't people that are used to trekking and running all over the place, and they're dragging along over here with their suitcases, and they need to do everything under the cover of night because the British are on their heels. And to make a long story short, the British part of the time follow them and they see what's going on part of the time. Some people will get to Kibbutz Yagur early enough. Others are going to be finding their way in bright daylight the following morning, making their way down the eastern ridge over here, the Carmel mountain range towards Kibbutz Yagur. The British are following them. And the British are going to actually stop the last group, the slowest group, outside of Kibbutz Yagur in order to arrest them and, do whatever. At this point, members of Kibbutz Yagur and members of other kibbutzim in the area are going to break into the circle that the British created, and they're going to literally pull the Jews who had escaped from Atlit out from the circle of British soldiers. They're going to shove them into Kibbutz Yagur and out of the reach of the British soldiers. Now, what we're going to do is let's take a look over here at this picture of Kibbutz Yagur. And in Kibbutz Yagur, there is a young boy who's 7 years old at that time. His name is Yoram Taharlev. Yoram Taharlev is going to later become a very famous poet and public figure culturally in Israel. And years later, if in 1945 he was 7 years old, it'll be about 40 years later, in the 1980s, that he's going to take his memories from when he was 7 years old and from these events, and he's going to turn into a song. And Yoram Taharlev says that he remembers firstly he remembers all the members of the kibbutz quickly running out to help, the people that were coming down the mountain range, and he remembers the people coming into the kibbutz and getting organized, and the kibbutz members giving them clothes and putting them around the kibbutz so that the British don't really know to recognize who escaped and who didn't. And he says, I remember seeing some of these people making their way down the mountain ridge in our direction, and they were exhausted, they were tired, and they were really, really trying, but it was tough. It was very, very tough. And he's going to write a song, which I could not find a translation, so I will translate it, and then we'll listen to the song and being sung. And it goes like this. It's called Tsel v'mei be'er, shade and water from the well. B'yamim asher ka'el. And again, I'm reminding you, 40 years later, is going back to this fateful morning of October the 10th, 1945. B'yamim asher ka'ele, mechakim ad bohalel. In days like this, we're waiting for the coming of the night. Mechakim letzeadim krevim. We're waiting for the footsteps coming close to us. Lo sogrim et habariach, lo tzmim et ha'inayim. B'yamim ka'ele, makshivim. We're not locking our door. We're not closing our eyes. We are listening. And then the chorus is, Mi shera'ev imtza etzleinu pacha lechem. Whoever is hungry will find bread with us. Mi she'ayef imtza potzel v'mei be'er. Whoever is tired will find shade and water in the well. Mi she'sukato nofelet. He who, him or her, of course, he who his home has fallen. Cheresh yikanes b'delet, shall quietly come into the door. Cheresh yikanes ve'ad olam yuchal hishaer. Quietly he can come inside and he will be able to stay forever. Zeh habayit shebaninu. This is the home we built. Zeh ha'oren shenatanu. This is the tree, the pine tree that we planted. Zeh hashvil v'zoi habe'er. This is the path and this is the well. Mi sheba lepo achinu. He who comes to here is our brother. Mi sheba yasev itanu. He who comes shall sit and be with us. V'hasha'ar shuv lo yisager. And the gate shall not close again. I don't think he just meant this for Kibbutz Yagur. I think he meant this for the entire land of Israel. And let's listen to the song, to the chorus of this very famous song.
שרועד ימצא אצלנו פת של לחם מי שעייף ימצא פוצל ומימר מי שסוכתו נופל חרש ייכנס בדלת חרש ייכנס והעולם יוכל להישאר שרעב ימצא אצלנו בת של לחם מי שעייף ימצא פוצל ומימר מי שסוכתו נופלת חרש ייכנס בדלת ותמיד יוכל להישאר.
We're going to finish by going back to the story, the personal story that we started with before, regarding the grandparents of my friend and colleague Yaniv Levi. And both Dov and Ita, both his grandparents, went through the detention camp. And when they were released, we can see this passport, not passport, this identity card that was created for Dov by the British. Now everything over here is in English. And Dov knew English, Hungarian, Romanian. But look, he insisted, and my friend Yaniv really emphasized this to me when he was explaining the chronicles of his family to me. He insisted that his grandfather sign his name in Hebrew. He said, that's it. Ani Yehudi Be'eretz Yisrael. I'm a Jew in the land of Israel. He could have signed in English. He could have signed in any other language. He insisted to sign in Ivrit. Then we spoke about a nation, a land, and a language coming together. He understands this. He signs it in Hebrew. In addition to that, we can see in this work card over here on the left side that he's being sent to Kfar Giladi, which is in the north of Israel, along with who will be his wife, Ita. We can see here is Dov over here, and Kfar Giladi in the north, working in agriculture. We can see Ita right over here, and they are later going to get married. And years later, we can see this picture over here, where we can see Ita with her 3 children, and we can see Ita now with the rest of the family and the rest of the generations. So with that, I want to say thank you very much. We spent the last 3 weeks talking about connecting a people, a nation, a land, and a language. Visited Tel Aviv Yafo. We got to know Eliezer Ben Yehuda in the Rishon LeZion Museum. We spent time now in Atlit, and I want to once again thank Beit Avi for making this possible. I want to thank Atlit, Detention Camp Today Museum, and the Rishon LeZion Museum for giving us the opportunity to virtually tour through their sites. And I want to once again thank Dive Technologies for allowing us to use their technology to visit these 2 sites of the many sites that they have. If you have any questions, comments, or remarks, you're more than welcome to email me. Toda rabah. Thank you very much.